All right, thank you, Donna, and welcome everyone who's here to learn more about interveners and intervention. I will infuse some things about me as we go through the presentation, but as Donna said, I run the Central Michigan University online training program for interveners. So it's all online. You can take the coursework from wherever she sends people there, not literally, not physically. So, but we have had some people from Maryland. I would welcome your interest. In addition to running that program and teaching the classes, I'm also the director of the Michigan State Deafblind Project. So I've known Donna a long time and getting to know some of her other staff. So I wear a bunch of hats, and like I said, you'll learn a little bit more about that as we go. So what will we cover today? We'll talk about the definition of intervener. We'll talk about the role of an intervener. I want to share with you the Canadian principles of intervention, then how interveners are trained. I'm going to spend some time on that, and then ideas for advocacy, because interveners are not yet in federal and many state laws or policies. So we need to do some advocacy, especially for parents in the audience. And then we'll talk about which states do have some regulations, and we'll talk about what pending legislation is out there. And then I'll share some research on interveners, because when you're trying to do advocacy and make something happen in terms of a system or in terms of a policy, then having some research in your back pocket is always a good idea. So when we think about intervener, most people, their frame of reference is Anne Sullivan and the work that she did with Helen Keller. And this is a famous photograph. It hangs at Perkins School for the Blind. I worked at Perkins in the deafblind department for several years before I went into my state deafblind project work. And so this is hanging prominent, or it was at the time, hanging prominently at one of the main buildings on campus. And so when someone says to me, what is an intervener? I start with this. I start to say, well, do you know Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller, that relationship? And most people will say, yeah, I do. And then I can use that and build so that we can really understand the concept of what an intervener is. So the National Center on Deafblindness, which, you know, Donna and I have explained that we're on the State Deafblind Project over the State Deafblind Projects, is a national project. So when we need help, we go to the national project. And one of the things that they do is help to provide info sheets and kind of help us set parameters by having a number of downloadable documents that we can share with other people. And one of those is a 2-page document for the definition of an intervener. They're actually, they created it in 2013. They updated it in 2019, and they're updating it right now. So there very soon there will be a 2021 document on the National Center website that you can download and take with you when you're talking to people about interveners. And one thing I'd like to say, I don't know if there are administrators in the audience. So if you are an administrator or you need to go talk to one about this, one thing to say is that an intervener is specific to someone who's deafblind. Sometimes the hesitancy about, oh, should we provide an intervener for this student? Well, if we provide one-on-one for that student, we're going to have to provide one-on-one for all of our students, and we can't afford that. That's not in the budget. But intervener, right in the definition, it says this is for a student who is deafblind. This is for a person who is deafblind. So if you have other kids in your classroom, your district, your school, whatever, who aren't deafblind, you don't even get to for them. Now, as I mentioned, the definition is 2 pages, so I'm not going to go over the whole thing now, but it does state only for kids who are deafblind, and it does say that interveners should have training based on the competencies that are established by the Council for Exceptional Children. So when you talk about an intervener, there's a set of training and skills and knowledge that they should have. So I'm going to spend some time on that in a few slides. So when I talk about what an intervener is, sometimes people have a hard time wrapping their head around exactly what I mean. So I also like to talk about what an intervener is not, because that actually helps people to develop that concept of intervener. So an intervener is not a paraprofessional. Paraprofessionals are assistants in a classroom. They help with lots of classroom duties. Sometimes they kind of float between classrooms. Sometimes they're specific for one classroom. They might even be hired specifically for one student. But a paraprofessional tends to have training that's more like don't go to college. They don't have a training program for how to be a paraprofessional. I wish they did, because paraprofessionals are actually some of the most important people at the school with the least amount of training. So I don't mean to, I'm not trying to diss paraprofessionals. They're critical people. They just don't have the same level of training that an intervener does. Some people talk about interveners as being paraprofessional level employees, and that's sort of true. In Michigan, what we have done to help people understand, we have a couple of districts, I think we're up to 3 or 4, that provide a differentiated. And what they base that on is they take the rate of pay for paraprofessionals and the rate of pay for educational interpreters, and they find the middle, and that's what they base intervener pay on. So districts that do a differentiated pay scale in Michigan are seeing that interveners are not quite paraprofessional level, but they don't have the same level of education and requirements that an interpreter does. So somewhere in there, in the middle. So interpreters, I've already talked about that. An intervener is not an interpreter. Now, having said that, an intervener can also be an interpreter. Some of them are, but they're 2 different tracks of training, right? You can train as an intervener, or you can train as an interpreter, or you can get both of those skill sets, right? Sometimes for students who are deafblind, who have very high levels of language, their intervener really needs to have that level of fluency and possibly the ability to actually interpret, which is not just fluency, but also a whole nother set of skills to take language 1 and language 2 and culture 1 and culture 2 and make sense out of all that. So sometimes an intervener should be an interpreter. I have a situation in Michigan where there is a student who benefits from interpreters, but they also need an intervener. So why would that be that they couldn't be the same person? Well, because visually they can see the interpreter at the front of the room if they have the right seat in the classroom. Then they need someone there to build on concepts and to make visual adaptations. So the interpreter needs to be in a very set specific space, and then the intervener needs to sit nearby and make adaptations on the fly. So you can have that dynamic where you need 2 separate people for one student. Then we also have teachers, and interveners are not teachers. What happens sometimes on a team though is you have this intervener who's got this training in deafblindness, and everyone looks at this person as the expert in deafblindness. And The teacher kind of feels a little intimidated, or maybe some of the other staff are like, well, I don't really know deafblind, so I'm gonna let the intervener do that. And people step back. And that's not the dynamic that we want at all. When I'm training interveners at CMU, we spend a lot of time on teamwork and the roles of different people on the team and how everyone should work together. And during this presentation, I will talk about the process of intervention, which is different than an intervener. So they're not teachers. Teachers have bachelor's or master's level education. Teachers have training in lesson planning and curriculum and assessment that interveners do not have. So the student who's deafblind needs to be taught by teachers with the support of an intervener. Then we have therapists. Now, there's all kinds of therapists, right? Like occupational therapists, OTs, physical therapists, PTs. There might actually be like a counseling type of therapist. And so the intervener is none of those things. But what an intervener can do is go to the pullout with the PT and the OT and the speech pathologist and all those therapists and watch that professional work with that student and support the student to get every benefit from that lesson. And then instead of it just being that half hour or 45 minutes, those skills that the therapist has worked with the student on, the intervener can then help to integrate those skills and all of those important things that are happening throughout all day, every day at school. And so that's where some of that magic as an intervener is happening, because therapists have huge caseloads. In Michigan, we have shortages of all kinds of professionals. And so people are really tightly stretched across the district, trying to pop around to schools and see everyone. An intervener can take that knowledge, and there can be some role release and implement things throughout the week. And what we see then is greater student performance. We see more outcomes for kids. Goals are being met. And so when you come together as an IEP team, you can be like, check, 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 because so much has happened for the student because of the level of consistency and implementation that's been able to happen. Then we have consultants, those teacher consultants for the visually impaired and teacher consultants for the deaf and hard of hearing. And those people are highly trained and specialized, and the intervener really needs them to support the intervention that's happening, to say, here are some great strategies for that vision loss. Here are some great strategies to make the environment accessible for the person who's deaf or hard of hearing. And it's a real issue if those consultants don't rally behind the intervener. Then nurses. Some students who are deafblind have a lot of medical needs that come with their etiology or with them as just a person, and they actually require nursing care. Now, nurses, my mom is a retired nurse. Nurses are people who care for people, who take care of people, who do for people. Let me do that for you. And interveners are fostering independence and having the person do for themselves. And they have no medical training. An intervener has no medical training. Some interveners can be trained to help with trachs or with G-tubes, sometimes with toileting kinds of things, but they are not nurses and shouldn't be looked at as skilled medical care team. I've had in schools where a student does have both a nurse and an intervener. And so they have to learn to team together. And then this is kind of for the parents out there. Interveners are not spies. And I mean that with all due respect. As a person who has had a child in a school, not on an IEP, but on a 504 plan. I know what it's like where you're trying to figure out like what's happening at school and what's being implemented and who's doing what and who should I be kind of getting after and who should I, be thanking. And it could be easy to say to the intervener, since they're with the child all day long in every situation, to say, hey, could you tell me, could you send me a text? Can you, chat with me during pickup or drop off? What's going on at the school? And I really caution the student interveners at CMU not to fall into that trap. It's important for interveners and parents to be able to have a really good positive relationship. But if you start kind of as an intervener being the person who's relaying information between what's happening at school and what's happening, at home or whatever, to be that middle person, that can get really sticky. There can be a lot of drama that happens, sometimes very unintentionally, sometimes maybe a little purposefully, but we don't want to set that up as a situation. So as much as possible, when I talk to parents and interveners and the IEP team as a whole, I say, don't expect the intervener to do that. The teacher or the case manager really needs to be the point of contact. And that's not to say the intervener and parents can't talk or family members can't talk. They certainly can, but primary point of contact really needs to be someone like the teacher. And different schools and different districts have different policies. And what I tell people is make sure you know what that policy is and follow that. So the whole thing with the intervener is because they're with the student all day, every day, they really get to know that person, especially for kids who are more nonverbal or emergent communicators, that they're getting to know what their little signals are. And that intervener student relationship is really an intimate one. And interveners develop this trust with the student that other people on the team tend not to have. Even people who've known that student a really long time can't parallel what time. And so when I talk to teams, I say, you know what? Don't be intimidated by that relationship. Celebrate that relationship. See how you can tap into that relationship so that, when you're doing a pull-out physical therapy or speech lesson, or the vision consultant or the orientation mobility specialist is teaching some important skills. Sometimes when you pop in and out, you can't achieve what you want to with the student because you don't have that time to really bond with them. But if you can have the student and the intervener and work on the skills through the intervener and really benefit from that trusting relationship, that's where the skills start to get checked off. So don't be intimidated by the student intervener relationship. It's special and it can really be a benefit. And I hope that's how people learn to think about it. Having an intervener on the team is just a huge benefit to achieving student educational outcomes. So an intervener is just a member of the team. And that is really how I hope that teams value the intervener. Right now, because the whole idea, the whole role of an intervener is so new in the educational system, sometimes they're not valued in the way that we hope that they will be in the future. And so teams might say, well, you don't need to come to the meeting. You don't need to be at the IEP. But who's with the student all day, every day? The intervener, right? And who might have some special insight into writing future goals or how things could be adapted. Or just even talking about barriers with the team. It's the intervener. And so the team who can value the intervener and welcome the intervener into the team setting and into the team dynamic is the team that's going to have more success. And so in Michigan, we have a lot of interveners working compared to other states, and it's still something that is a struggle in some districts. So it's not something I've figured out how to make happen in Michigan, but it's an important dynamic. And I hope that we get to a point where schools can say, of course, the intervener's coming to this meeting. Of course, we have to schedule the IEP at a time the intervener can come. Or yes, as an administrator, I will pay for the intervener to stay after school to join us, that kind of thing. So the intervener should work with every member of the team, especially the teacher. And the teacher needs to be able to say, here are some lessons that are coming up so that you can make adaptations. And the team should try to give the intervener a little bit of planning time so they can take things and make adaptations. I always tell my intervener students, though, you have to be sharp. You have to be willing to work on the fly, make adaptations on the fly, but everyone can work better when they have some advance notice and some planning time and can gather materials. But that's a perfect world. So we can have that sometimes, but other times we need to make immediate decisions and work on the fly. So in a perfect world, interveners would work on teams of teachers of the deafblind. And I told you I'd tell you a little bit about my background. I am a teacher of the deafblind. I was trained at Boston College and I worked at Perkins School for the Blind in the deafblind department. But not many people have that experience or training. And so there aren't enough teachers of the deafblind to go around to be involved in supervised interveners. But in a perfect world, that would happen. Instead, we have the vision consultants and the teacher consultants for the deaf and hard of hearing and rallying around those interveners and trying to provide that support. Then, as I said, an intervener should be present during therapies and pull-out sessions with professionals on the team to train and so that they can continue to implement those skills that the student needs. And it's not a good time for the intervener to take a break, you know, like, oh, he's going to PT, I'm going to take a break now. That's maybe one of the worst times to take a break. So interveners should also be available to the student during all assessments, right? If you're going to have an intervener for a student and you're going to have them providing accommodations all day long, and then maybe the school psychologist is going to come in and pull the student and go do an assessment, yikes, we have to have the intervener with the student during that assessment, because otherwise how are you going to get an accurate result, right? Now, but in the field of deafblindness, there's not an assessment that is normed for students who are deafblind. It's not possible to achieve that because the diversity of the population of students who are deafblind. You'd practically need an assessment for every student, and that's not possible. Nor is it possible to pull out a kid and get an accurate assessment without accommodations. So there's got to be a happy medium. And sometimes we don't end up with a score, but we end up with some good information that can guide the team for making accurate goals and objectives and making accurate decisions about the supports that the student needs. And that's just the nature of the beast of deafblindness. And then, as I already said, I've already kind of said over and over that intervener needs to be in the team meetings and part of the discussion. and valued member of the team. And I put that last bullet here about interveners being new concepts for school personnel, because as I said, I've spent a lot of time talking about the concept of intervener and building that up for you. In the same way that you're listening to this presentation, if you went to talk to a school team as a parent or as a fellow professional to say, hey, we need to think about an intervener for this student, probably some of the people on the team are going to be like, oh, what? And you need to build the concept. So do take this information with you and gradually build on the concept. Well, Helen Keller, Anne Sullivan, and then build it out for them in the same way, so that you can, sometimes you get the biggest pushback from people who don't understand what it even is you're asking for. Like you say, I need an intervener for my son or daughter. And the school is automatically like, nope, we don't do that. But then you're like, well, my son or daughter is deafblind. They, don't access the information. They need some support. They need some accommodations. Who's going to provide that? And, let's think about this thing. Well, an intervener is this person who provides accommodations. And so sometimes the pushback is about lack of understanding. So try to be patient and grow that concept within the district, and then do your advocacy. So, intervener, I've spent a lot of time on what it is and what it isn't, but I do want to talk about how an intervener is a person and intervention is a process. And so now I'm going to shift gears and talk about that. So, interveners are successful because they can provide consistent support across all environments and all activities. And so that's what intervention should look like. And interveners need breaks, right? Interveners are human beings. It might just be to go to the bathroom or to eat lunch. It might be that they have a family and they end up missing a day of work, or they get sick themselves. Right now we're in a pandemic, so different people are, quarantining or whatever. And you need to have subs. You need to have people who can fill in when that intervener is not there. And so having a team who understands the process of intervention can mean that other people can go in and support the student when the intervener is not there. Some districts are really on top of it, and they have a trained sub that is really an intervener. But that's not always the case. That's not the real world yet, because there aren't enough interveners to go around right now. It's too new, and so we don't have enough people trained. So that last bullet on this side is something I really want to make sure to emphasize. Students rely on information and the access, not the person. So sometimes the pushback is, okay, I get what an intervener is, but if we get an intervener for that student's gonna be so dependent on that intervener. So that's gonna be a disaster. We can't do that. That's lack of understanding. A trained intervener is constantly pushing the student to build their independence, to be as independent as they can be. And so that's not an accurate pushback. That's a red flag to me that says someone doesn't understand what an intervener really is, and that I need to spend a little more time explaining it so that they can better understand. What I didn't say already is that the intervener model started in Canada. We hold up Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan as the example, but Canada looked at that model and said, we want to do that. We want to do that for kids who are deafblind. In fact, for all people who are deafblind. And the Canadian government agreed and set aside some money. And so the model is quite established in Canada. It's not and more supported on higher levels in Canada than it is in the United States. So we look to them for support and for help on how to grow this model in the United States. And that last bullet is one of the things that our Canadian friends have shared with us, that if you have a student who's deafblind and you have two interveners, and one works in the morning and one works in the afternoon, or one is there to provide breaks for the other intervener. So you have two, as long as they have a very similar skill set, you know, equal training, similar skills, similar knowledge, then they are going to be able to provide a level of intervention that the student's going to accept. And because the support feels equal, there won't be an issue. But if you have an intervener that's top notch, or with an intervener that doesn't have training, or for whatever reason is not at the same skill set, I mean, we all have different skill sets, right? And so not everyone can be the best. So you have an awesome intervener and an intervener, there's going to be a problem. We might see students shut down, we might see a behavior problem, we might see just that they're not as engaged as they were with the other person. So what we need to do is make sure we support that intervener that's only kind of and see how we can get their skill set up to be more equivalent to the really good intervener. So again, the Canadians who have more experience with interveners say you can have a student that becomes reliant on the support and the information that interveners provide, but they don't become reliant on the specific person. And that can happen without the right training. Without the right training, if you have someone who's hovering and doing for and taking care of, that can feel kind of like a parent relationship almost. And the student who's deafblind could become really reliant on that person. So I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying that with the right training, a good trained intervener would not try to create that level of dependence. So here we have the principles of intervention that I mentioned I was going to cover. So the Canadians are saying to the world, we have interveners working in Canada. It's awesome. People who are deafblind have high quality of life. They're achieving their potential. They're engaged in activities. They're out there living their best lives. And you, world, you need to understand this and do this too, because you all have deafblind people in your countries too. So they came up with these 11 principles. CDVA is the Canadian Deafblind Association. It used to be the Canadian Deafblind Rubella Association, which if you know about deafblindness, in the 1960s, we had this huge issue with German measles, rubella. And the rubella epidemic is really what, all of a sudden, this really low incidence disability became more prevalent because we had more kids who had vision loss and hearing loss because of rubella. And so Canadian Deafblind Rubella Association developed the principles, but now that rubella is basically eradicated, we still see it once in a while, they dropped the rubella. So now they're just the Canadian Deafblind Association. They have these 11 principles. I'm going to go over them with you because I really feel strongly that an intervener is a person, intervention is a process, and people on the team need to understand how to support this kid who's deafblind. You can't just say, we hired an intervener, we're done. Everyone needs to work at it, and in order for the person to be really successful. So first, the Canadians tell us that you really should have unconditional belief in that person who's deafblind, in that student. And how can you argue with that, right? You have to believe that person is a capable person, that they can and should be in school doing what other kids are doing and have a right to their communication and all of those things. So you have to believe in the person. Two, you have to believe that intervention is valuable, right? Special education, you know, it takes the right people to be in special education, but it really takes the right person to get intervention right. And so you have to believe in these 11 principles. You have to believe in the intervener model in order for it to be successful. Then 3, the amount of intervention should be individualized. That is, you know, some of these are like, okay, yeah, don't spend too much time on this because these are obvious, but this, maybe they're not so obvious as we get closer to 11, but we need to individualize. So when you're an intervener working with one student and you get really good at it, you know, maybe that student moves, maybe the student graduates, or something terrible happens. You get a new student, you're going to be on a learning curve because you've been with that other student, individualizing and accommodating for them. New student who's deafblind, small, diverse population, you've got to learn how to meet the needs of that other student. So when I teach interveners, we talk a lot about having a bag of tricks, right? So this bag of tricks is just a bunch of skills and knowledge that may or may not apply to the student you're with, but it's good to keep it in that bag because one day in the future, you're going to have a different person that you're supporting and you're going to need to individualize. And so you need to pull some things out of that bag. So number 4 is people who are deafblind have the right to access information in their particular mode. We have kids who are deafblind who are fluent language users, either in English or ASL or some other language. And we have students who are on very therapeutic, heavily supported programs where they're communicating with slight gestures, they are flushed or not flushed, or their muscle tone is rigid or not. I mean, they're communicating on that level that, you know, that's quite the span, right? From fluent language user down to, we're talking about muscle rigidity. So we need to respect where the person who's deafblind is at, and we need to help them make gains in language and communication. That person that's communicating through language, you know, muscle rigidity, they have a lot of improvement that they might make if they have the right supports and the right accommodations. The person who is a fluent language communicator, what we're learning, well, we've known, and some of the research and kind of action research that's happening in the field right now, is we're really paying attention to those kids at the fluent language level that sometimes they have this awesome language capability, but the foundation is kind of sand. And so as they start to move in different environments and learn different subjects, the things start to shift and we start to see that their concept development is not what it could have been or should have been. And so they've got like these Swiss cheese kind of concepts about some of how the world works. And Robbie Bleha is a really good presenter on that topic. If you can catch her live or on a recording. And so we need to meet the person where they are at and help them build and become better. An intervener who's with someone, like watching their little subtle nonverbals, you know, might understand that when a student is in like advanced chemistry, that they don't really get what the teacher's talking about, like the concept's not quite there. And so the intervener can come in and make an adaptation. Or, you know, we've got this other student who needs intense physical therapy. And so again, the intervener's watching to see if there can be a way that they can help the physical therapist better reach the student. So always there, always. Number 5, this is like the flagship of intervention. This is it. This could almost be number 1. Do with, not for. And that's what I've been alluding to this whole time, where I'm saying, you know, an intervener is not going to create dependence. An intervener who's got good training is going to figure out ways to help the student do it as much by themselves as possible through some accommodations. And the trained intervener is going to know when they can kind of fade out and step back as the student learns how to do it more and more by themselves. So it's constantly do with, not for. And intervention takes long time sometimes. You know, in order to get the student to, you know, learn how to independently take their coat off when they arrive at school. All kinds of goals and objectives go with that, right? There's, you know, all of the fine motor and gross motor of that, all of the communication associated with that. It's not just coming into school as fast as you can and getting that coat off as fast as you can and then getting into class. It's building on every learning opportunity and doing with the student. So it just takes longer, but everything can be a really rich learning opportunity for the student who's deafblind in a really functional kind of way, which is the best way for them to learn. Then 6 is no assumptions should be made regarding the abilities of a person who's deafblind. You know, sometimes I don't have to really spend a lot of time on this because the people who come to the presentations about interveners, they're invested and they get that. They know that people who are deafblind are very capable people. But as human beings, sometimes we can be a little judgy. And sometimes, you know, if we see someone who has multiple disabilities or maybe a lot of medical needs, we might think, well, this activity is not for them. You know, we'll figure out something else that they can do. And the intervener model says, no, hang on. That's the activity everyone else is doing. Let's see what adaptations we can make for this person so that they can be as engaged as possible with that activity. Let's figure it out. Let's roll up our sleeves. You know, it could be some pre-teaching so that they're exposed to materials and they kind of get the gist of what's going to happen and they get to practice it a little bit before they engage with the group. It might be teaching some vocabulary. It might be whatever, making some high contrast materials so that they can see what's happening. Or it might be like, hey, you know, if we have an interpreter here, this is going to work much better. That kind of thing. But never making an assumption about, this isn't for them. Maybe it can be. Let's figure it out. And that's where that team dynamic is so important when it comes to the intervener model. So, number 7, never underestimate the importance of the relationship between the intervener and the student. This is the magic, right? That's the intervener and the student are together. And when other professionals understand that and work through the intervener, that's the good stuff. Number 8, the process of intervention must always provide the person who's deafblind with anticipation, motivation, communication, and confirmation. Now, my neighbors, I'm in Michigan, so I'm a neighbor with Canada. They call these the 4 factors of deafblindness. adopted that language, and I've started to call these the 4 factors of deafblindness. And an intervener can address all of these things in an effort to keep the student engaged and to make accommodations for them. Anticipation, when we're deafblind, you might have some functional vision or functional hearing. You might, have more mild loss, or you might have very profound, very significant losses. You might have additional disabilities, you might not. Regardless, your ability to gain instant access to information. Incidentally, you walk into a room, as hearing sighted people, we just glance around and we learn like 1,000 things about what's going on in the room without even trying. Someone who doesn't see well or hear well, or who maybe is blind and deaf completely, has additional disabilities, maybe a cognitive disability that is going to require some extra processing time, that is going to impact anticipation, right? If you can't get information incidentally like that from walking in a room, you're not going to know what's happening in the room. You can't anticipate what's going to happen to you because you went in the room. So imagine the school environment and all the transitions from different classes, the different settings. You have the classroom, it's maybe a more controlled environment. Then you go into the gym, or you go into the cafeteria, or you go outside for recess. Chaos, right? And so we have to have ways for students who are deafblind to anticipate what's going to happen. There's lots of strategies for that, and those are whole presentations in and of themselves. But an intervener has training in strategies to build anticipation throughout the day, throughout activities. Major factor of deafblindness. Motivation. When you don't see well or hear well, or you might have other things happening too, you might not be that motivated if there's chaos in the gym. You might be like, yeah, no thanks, I'm just gonna sit over here by myself. That's chaotic. So an intervener needs to have strategies in their bag of tricks to motivate students to get involved and stay involved. And having someone who's right there with the student, who knows them really well, can constantly build on the motivation. And for kids who are deafblind, a lot of times that's external motivation. Sometimes there's not a lot of internal motivation to do what we want them to do. And then communication, that's kind of the most obvious one. That we have students who communicate with behavior, with objects, with pictures, with signs or words, fluent communicators, all kinds of communication and constant adaptations to meet those needs and grow and expand the communication and grow and expand the concept development. Again, I cannot emphasize concept development, even for those fluent language users. We have to constantly do concept checks to make sure that they're okay and they don't have that Swiss cheese effect. Then confirmation. Sometimes people think good idea, good job, like a reinforcement. And that can be, yes, it can be. But it's also the impact that you have on the situation, right? So let's say a student who's deafblind is walking down the hall using their mobility cane, right? And so they're tapping it as they should. And the cane knocks someone's water bottle. The water bottle dumps and it spills everywhere. And, it gets on someone's shoes, and their fancy shoes, or it gets in someone's backpack, it ruins someone's paper. Person who's deafblind, they don't have the incidental information. They're clipping along with their mobility cane. They don't even know what happened. They have no confirmation of what happened when their cane connected with that thing that maybe they thought it was the wall. They don't even think about it. So the intervener can run up and say, hey, look, and draw their attention to it. and help the person who's deafblind to appropriately engage in that situation. Maybe you're going to help clean up. Maybe you're going to say sorry. Maybe, I don't know what else you're going to do. Maybe go tell the of people who are deafblind, particularly like Charge syndrome. When I think of kids who have Charge syndrome, a lot of them have these like wicked personalities that great sense of humor. And so they're constantly doing these funny things and saying or saying things that make people laugh. And they might not realize it. They might, make a comment and people in the room are laughing and they might not realize how much joy they brought the people in the room. Laughter is so important, particularly in the situation we find ourselves in with this constant stress of the pandemic. And when you have someone who's making a joke, that can be such like an ego, like a self-confidence boost. It can be so important, for kids in terms of the bonding with their peers, in terms of just how they feel about themselves, that they had a positive impact. Maybe someone dropped something, the intervener makes the person who's deafblind aware of it, that person picks it up and hands it to the person. Maybe that person smiles and says, "Thank you so much." And the person who's deafblind might miss some or all of that. So again, something a little bit that might seem real insignificant, just picking up a piece of paper, letting them know the person is smiling, they're so happy, thank you. Those peer interactions are really important, and an intervener can do a lot to foster that as well. That's something I hadn't mentioned, but those are the 4 factors. And so if you take anything away, I hope you can kind of tell people what an intervener is, but I also hope you can talk about these 4 factors, because in terms of a team supporting a kid who's deafblind, those 4 factors, they'll get you a long way if you get those addressed. All right, so number 9, every experience is an opportunity to provide information. And I kind of mentioned that with the hanging up the coat. Everything can just be a lesson where you can pull different parts of the IEP and build skills just constantly throughout the day. And that's, again, you meet as an IEP team and you're like, goal met, goal met, goal met, because the intervener has been a part of the team and a part of the dialogue and has the skills to constantly implement that throughout the day. Then focus, number 10, focus of intervention should always be on the person who's deafblind. So the intervener is assigned for that student and no one else. And so if the classroom is a little chaotic, the intervener, the role of the intervener should be making the student aware of all the different chaos that's happening in the room. They're assigned to that person to provide access to that person. And if the intervener gets pulled to do something else, access is gone. If the team isn't strong in intervention, maybe someone else pops in and is providing access. And in that case, it's okay. But if the student's just sitting there by themselves, unless they really just need a break, and sometimes we do, we just need to have a break. You've got to have the intervener and respect that their focus needs to be on that student. And if you're a teacher and you're supervising a classroom and you have an intervener who keeps pulling their phone out of their pocket, that's a red flag. That shouldn't be happening. And the intervener should be focused on the student. And then the final one is number 11, and it's the longest one, but it can be summed up as interveners need training and they need professional development. Just like anyone else on the educational team, you have to keep fostering and feeding your skill set and your knowledge set so that you can have a nice bag of tricks and you can stay up on any changes that have happened. One example in the field is cortical vision impairment. What we've known about cortical vision impairment has kind of evolved. And if you're an intervener and you're like, well, I had training in that a long time ago, I'm good. Maybe not. Attending some trainings to refresh and learn where we're at now with cortical vision impairment and all the little subtleties that can really make a difference for your student. So the team needs to respect that too. And districts need to make sure that there's time and some funding to make sure that interveners can access that training. So those are the 11 principles of intervention, some more obvious than others. If you're a person who's like, okay, that's great, Beth, that's wonderful. I wish I could just see that in action though, because I'm a visual person. I've got that for you. We're not gonna watch it today because we don't have that kind of time, but I will point out this video clip. All you have to do is Google it or put it in your browser, whatever. And Jarvis goes to the drum store. Search, and you will find the most amazing clip. It's open access, so you don't have to join anything or do anything special to watch it. It'll be right out there, and it's only 12 minutes long, so you can watch it. You can take it to a team meeting and have other people on the team watch it. And these, in this clip, there are 3 people who support a student named Jarvis. The clip is a little old. I think it's like from the 90s or something, but it's magic and I haven't found anything that can replace it. So all 11 principles are in this clip. So within 12 minutes, you can see flawless intervention being provided. And we have 3 people, they're all trained, they're all supporting Jarvis. We have 1 person who's preparing him to go to the drum store, right? Building the anticipation, explaining what's gonna happen in the day so that Jarvis feels comfortable about what's going on. Then we have another person who's supporting Jarvis during the activity and acknowledging him and what he wants to do, what he's motivated to do, and what he's hesitant to do, and trying to motivate him to get engaged in those things that he's not so sure about. And then the third person is talking to Jarvis about the experience at the drum store. It happened before, and they're using an experience book to talk about the drum store. And so all 3 people, flawless intervention. And so when you are on a team and you want to look at this model and you think, well, you know, we could hire an intervener, but even if we do, we as a team need to buy into this. This is a little training video that you could use and you could kind of like emulate what they do on an individualized basis. So don't support your students. Not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, like, this is the 11 principles in action, and you can learn to implement them yourself. So now, this is where we're going to shift gears, and I'm going to talk to you about training for interveners. So what does that entail? In the United States, we have 2 possibilities. You can get a national credential, you can get a national certificate. The national credential is where I'm going to focus my time. It's the model we use in Michigan, and I know it's the model that Donna and the Deafblind Project staff have been supporting in Maryland as well. Other states are doing other things. It kind of depends on, you know, your state Department of Ed and what the value system is for training. The national credential requires higher ed training. So you have to take college classes to earn the national credential. The certificate training does not require higher ed. There are other training models. And so you really need to figure out what is relevant and important and what is required within your state or district. So for training, the national credential, right now in the United States, there are 2 online programs. One is through Central Michigan University, which I developed and teach. And the other has been around longer. It's at Utah State University, run by Linda Alsop. And she was instrumental in helping me to develop and build the CMU program. So now they're kind of, they're a little different. And so when you're wondering like, well, which one should I choose? Utah takes a year and a half. It's 3 full semesters. And the CMU program can be done in 1 academic year, so 2 semesters. So one's a little faster, one takes a little longer. The CMU program, because it was developed more recently, some of the videos and the technology elements will be a little different than the Utah program. So again, it's you need to look at what's available and what is a good fit for you in terms of what feels comfortable for training. Do you want to get in there and get it done? Or do you want something that's going to be a little more slow paced, that kind of thing? So, as I said, I'm going to spend most of my time on this national credential because that's my bias, I guess. So with the national credential, it's offered through the National Resource Center for Paraeducators. And they also do some other related service kinds of things. So they will look at a portfolio. So an intervener who's going for the national credential does their higher ed coursework. With the CMU program, right away in the first of the 4 classes, you are starting your portfolio. The portfolio is what gets submitted to NRC Para, that's the short name, NRC Para, to evaluate, have you met the knowledge and skill requirements to be a nationally credentialed intervener. With Utah, they do the coursework, and then at the end, you work on your portfolio. So that's another difference. So when you're working on your portfolio, you get coaching from an expert in deafblindness. Often, most of the time, that's someone from your state deafblind project. So at CMU, I work with Donna and Jen and other staff, and we figure out who's going to do the coaching for each of the intervener students. And so I do the teaching of the courses, and the State Deafblind Project does the on-site coaching. And it's really important as the interveners learning these new knowledge and skills that they have someone who can observe them with their student and give them feedback about their implementation, give them some guidance about what they're doing right or what they could tweak and do a little differently. That coaching is really critical piece. And this portfolio and the coaching feedback forms, those get submitted to NRC Para. And the staff looks through the portfolio to make sure that it's up to par. If it is, then the intervener student can submit $100 processing fee, and they in turn get their national credential mailed to them. So it either takes a year or about a year and a half to get trained as an intervener if you're going for the national credential. As I said, that's kind of where I lean. That's what I think is important and right. For those other training programs in the national certificate, sometimes it's just a series of workshops. Sometimes it's taking some modules online, and there's not that interaction with the coaches. There might not be the portfolio and all that reflection that entails. And what I will share when I get to the research is how important those elements are. So, advocating for an intervener. Now, you know a little bit about the training, you know what an intervener is, how do you make it happen? One of the ways you make it happen, I can't say enough, is to get involved with your state deafblind project, because they're going to know the latest and greatest on the research and what's happening in other states, and help you to kind of try to make it happen within your team. So as I mentioned, interveners are not mandated yet. There's no federal legislation. Some states do have policy or their own legislation, but there are people working to make it happen on the national level, and I'll explain some of that in the next couple of slides. So Michigan's not a state that has a mandate. So we've been trying to get creative on how to make this happen on an individual team level. And fortunately, we've been pretty successful. When I say pretty successful, I would say right now we probably have 20 to 25 students with an intervener on their IEP, and we have about 330 students in Michigan. So success is relative. And Michigan is one of the states with some of the most interveners. So this is new. It's nothing to feel, I do feel dismayed sometimes that more students don't have interveners, but I'm also proud that we've succeeded on an individual level multiple times. We'd have more, but some students have moved or graduated. So it's not like 20 is the pinnacle, but it's just where we're at right now. So in a state that doesn't have legislation, you have to count, your successes. You have to pat yourself on the back when you can, and then just keep fighting another day, right? So even states though that have policies, the policies are so new that they haven't really seen a massive impact. So it's just where we're at. We'll get there. This is going to grow and it's going to get bigger. We're just in infancy right now, and it's hard not to. We're seeing good things. So one of the things that I sort of talked about earlier was the team discussion guide. I had said that you can get together as a team and talk about level of access for the student in the different environments that they're in. What is the accommodations list look like, and who is providing those accommodations, and how is that sustainable over time? The National Center for Deafblindness has an IEP discussion guide that walks you through that discussion. So you can go to their website, you can Google it. Maryland might have it on their website. It's very easy to get. It's a multiple page document, but it's meant to say to the team, listen, the student is in multiple environments. Let's talk about how they're accommodated in each environment. Let's talk about who provides those accommodations. Let's talk about, is that a person who's always available or just sometimes, and it really generates some good talk. So sometimes the team can come to the decision on their own through this dialogue. You know what? Maybe we do need that intervener. Maybe we do. And so it's not someone from the outside saying you have to do this, this is the right thing, but it's organic within the team to say, yeah, that discussion guide, I get it. We do need an intervener. So it's worth a try. Utah State University has this grant kind of center, Sky High, and they generated this little manual that's now a PDF online, and it's a family guide to interveners. And it talks about what is an intervener, how do you advocate for an intervener. It's got all kinds of pointers for parents who want to try to make this happen at their child's school. Then one of the newer things that has happened is the United States Department of Ed issued a memo that says that, okay, administrators, you're right, intervener is not in federal law. It is not in IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which mandates special education. Intervener is not in there, you're right. But we as a department are going to give you permission to use IDEA money to pay for interveners. So if you have an administrator that says can't pay, can't do it, it's not in the law, you could download and print this, just a quick Google search, and you can take that memo with you. It's signed by Ruth Ryder, who was acting director at the time, and you can say, but actually you can use IDEA money, it says right here. So that's a good tool. Then there are some federal laws that talk about access. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, provides equal access under the law. So you can say, well, you're right, special ed law does not say intervener, but there's this other law that talks about equal access. This child is deafblind. In order to have equal access, they would benefit from an intervener. So there's that tool that you can use. Then the final bullet on this slide talks about FAPE, free and appropriate public education. And that's section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a different federal law. And that says that kids in the United States have to have a free and appropriate public education. And that word appropriate, if you have a child who's deafblind and they're sitting in a classroom and they don't have the same access that their peers in that classroom have, then are they getting a free and appropriate public education? You can maybe use that in your bag of tricks that you will need to advocate and make an intervener happen on a team. Because you're doing it ahead of specific legislation that would mandate the intervener. So know kind of what's out there and how you might be able to use it in your advocacy efforts. So I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, but I do want you to know that there are some states that already have legislation or policies. Some of them, remember I said, know what your state expects. Do they need higher ed, or are other forms of training going to be okay? And West Virginia, Wisconsin, they say we need higher ed. We need to have the national credential. Then we have some states, Illinois and Virginia, saying, you know what, it doesn't matter. As long as you have a national certificate or the credential, that's good enough. And then we have some states that are doing kind of their own thing. Utah, interveners are trained through their state school. And it's a pretty rigorous training. Some of them have done a portfolio. And I did mention that portfolio is a critical piece. Then we have, in Utah, that's the one state that also has a law for teacher of the deafblind. So if you're looking in the United States about like where have they figured it out, Utah has figured it out. And it's a model that we can all try to emulate and make happen in our own states. And Minnesota, they have a training through their state deafblind project that it's a ongoing training where people go and receive training from the project. And again, some of those people have done a portfolio, some of them have not. And then Texas, they are very supportive of the national credential for intervener training, but I've singled them out because they're working really hard on teacher of the deafblind. And so they're coming up with a credential for like a micro credential for teachers of the deafblind there. So, and they also, Minnesota and Texas have educational interveners, but they also have interveners that work in the community, which I'm very envious of, and I hope someday we can work on that in Michigan as well. So, when you're doing your advocacy, it's good to know what's on the horizon as well. And IDEA, that federal law for special education, it's up for reauthorization, and it has been up for reauthorization for a really long time. And so it's well overdue, and advocates who work in Washington, DC really like to wait until things are kind of in a democratic light, because Democrats tend to smile more when it comes to special education and do a little more. And so now that there's the Biden administration, there might be a heavier push to actually try to get IDEA reauthorized. We'll see, but it's been up for a long time. And if it was, there's groups working to make sure that when all the related services are listed in IDEA, right around where it says interpreter, it will also say intervener. Then we have a separate law called the Alice Cogswell and Sullivan Macy Act. And there's a group that has reintroduced and advocated for that. It's been in Congress, and then it goes away, and then it comes back. And right now, every time it gets reintroduced, it gets new numbers. So these are the current numbers: HR 1959 or Senate Bill 813. And right now, it does have bipartisan support, which is important, but it bounces around. And it's done this a few times. It bounces around and gets nowhere. Then it has to be reintroduced, and it bounces around as new legislation does. If you want to stay up and current on what's going on with that act, you can go to cogswellmacyact.org, and it's a website dedicated to just this legislation. And it's what this legislation is it's an acknowledgement that IDEA falls short in some areas for kids who are blind, visually impaired, deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind. And so people in those particular fields have said, this is what we need on top of IDEA. We need more, and this is what it is. And it just hasn't been able to garner enough support to go all the way through yet. But if you are kind of have political leanings, if you like to be, make calls to your representatives and your senators, get involved with Cogswell Macy Act. And when you go to the website, it'll explain how you can get involved and roll up your sleeves and kind of be more action oriented to try to get the policy on a national level. They also sometimes have internet meetings that you can join in to learn what's happening with it now. So go to that website. Now, the research. I don't want to run out of time and not tell you about the research. So right now there are two studies that I can tell you about on interveners. One happened in 1994. Awesome study, 3-year study, a longitudinal study. That's unheard of. And they took a group of kids in Utah who had interveners, other states who did not have interveners, and they tracked them over 3 years to see how development differed between the two. And guess what? Interveners are good for kids who are deafblind. They achieve more with communication, concept development, with relationships, with parent and family engagement across the board. This particular study involved kids that is on interveners is the one I just did for my dissertation. And I looked at how interveners learn the knowledge and skills that they need to support kids who are deafblind. And so when I'm telling you what are the key elements of training, it's because I just lived this research. And they need to have opportunities for trial and error, working with learning how to be an intervener while they're supporting a student who's deafblind is a key element. That trial and error, the making mistakes, learning from them, the support of a team and having the ability to brainstorm and dialogue and work it through problems, critical for interveners. And having someone with expertise come in to give feedback is a huge confidence booster, because sometimes interveners are like, I just don't know if I'm doing it right. And no one on my team really knows about deafblindness. So no one can really tell me if I'm doing it right. So the coach comes in and says, yes, you are doing it right. Or hang on, let's tweak this. Let's do it a little different. And so interveners grow really a lot from that. And a couple of times now I've said that portfolio is important. The reason it's important is the portfolio has all the competencies identified by the Council of Exceptional Children, and you have to take each competency. You have to write a reflection on how you do that with your student, or why you don't do it with your student, because maybe your student doesn't need that thing. And then you have to have an artifact, like a picture, a video clip, or someone else observing you do it, that verifies that, yes, in fact, you do that thing with your student. And that is just reflection to the nth degree, because you're literally taking your work, your role, and you're picking it apart by the competency, and you're showing how you do that. And that level of reflection that portfolio requires, it takes the learning that a new intervener goes through and takes it to another level. It's called transformational learning. And it just kind of like expands your thinking and expands your practice. And so regardless of how you go about training an intervener, that portfolio is a critical piece, because the reflection is what really is going to elevate that person's ability to support someone who's deafblind. And since I wrote a whole dissertation on it, I could go on about it all day, but I'll go to the next slide. So there are these other 3 studies. These studies have the word intervener in them because Coria Torres said an intervener could help a student who's deafblind have more peer interaction. That's all it says, but it acknowledges that an intervener has an important role in the peer interaction piece. Nelson, Height, and Greenfeld said that they just did a study of one student's time on task. And they said this student, their time on task in the classroom would be increased if they had the support of an intervener. So again, not about an intervener, but just a nod to the fact that interveners make a difference for kids who are deafblind. Then that final study is actually just more like a literature review. It's actually kind of the history of deafblind education, and it talks about teachers of the deafblind, it talks about the intervener model, talks about state deafblind projects, but it's a great piece that if you are going to do some advocacy, if you read through it, it gives you all of that rich history that you can kind of use to say the right things, if you know what I mean. Sometimes it's all about the word choice, and it can make a difference. So that is the research. And so I did want to leave in time just in case there were questions and answers, but like, I think there's 1 minute. So having said that, this is my contact information. And as I said, I work on the Michigan Deafblind Project. So, you know, Donna and her whole team with Jen and the others, they can provide you a ton of support. So I'm not trying to have you contact me instead of them. But that other hat that I wear as the director of the Deafblind Training Program for DBI, it's called Deafblind Intervener Training Program. That's for the United States, or really anyone in the world could take these classes. So if you are trying to advocate for an intervener or wanting to talk about intervener training, I would welcome you to email or call me. So I mean that. I always get excited when I get people from out of state contacting me with questions and see how I can help support them to make this happen. So that is it for me, Donna.